There's been a lot of talk about trade today. It's a very important issue for Canada. I think that if the TPP and CETA are both eventually ratified, Canada will have free trade with something like 60% of the global economy, and it'll move from something like number 19 in terms of the number of free trade agreements it has with other countries in the world to something like number 3 or 4. So it'll move, very rapidly up the rankings of free trading nations, which would be an impressive achievement. So we're going to talk today about what the opportunities are in Canada's trading relationships, what the obstacles might be, how likely it is that we'll see some of these good agreements, and what the effects could be on the Canadian economy, and other issues that I'm sure will come up. So what I'd like to direct my first question to Vishnu. I think last year, trade between India and Canada grew 29% to more than 8 billion Canadian dollars. So do you think that India could ever become as much of a locomotive for the Canadian economy as China has been? Or do you think the differences in economic structure and trade policy are going to make that unlikely?
Thank you, and greetings. The good news, as he said, was that the trade relations between India and Canada are growing rapidly. Investment ties are growing rapidly. In the last 24 months, as Indian economy is resurging, we have had something like $11 billion of Canadian pension fund investments going into India, $2 billion by Brookfield, and so on and so forth. So trade and you mentioned TPP. India and Canada is also looking at a SEPA, Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. We have had a few rounds of discussions. We are narrowing the differences. We are also looking at a FIPA, Foreign Investment Protection Agreement. Now, the background is that India is growing very rapidly. We have become the fastest growing major economy in the world now, last year with a growth rate of 7.9%. And we are well on the way to be the world's third largest economy by 2030, with a huge middle class of something like 600 million people with a good buying power. But when we come to talk about Canada, the reason why the economies are complementary to each other is that we have a huge need for an array of goods and services that Canada has to offer. Whether it's natural resources, whether it is energy products, uranium, potash, hydrocarbons, timber, but not just that, in areas like clean technologies, green technologies, education, and so on and so forth. So we have a strong relationship. We are putting in place the frameworks to sustain and infuse greater momentum, and we are very optimistic on taking this relationship forward.
So you mentioned these agreements that you're negotiating with Canada, but my understanding is that there are actually quite a lot of obstacles in the way. These things have been in discussion for quite a long time, and there are some barriers actually to achieving agreements on the Comprehensive Economic Partnership, for example, things to do with restrictions on the imports of farm products, corporate tax regulations. What are the obstacles? Why are they there? And how long is it going to take to remove them?
Well, as you are very well aware, trade relationships do take time. I don't know of any trade relationship or FTA which has been concluded in a jiffy and has happened overnight. So certainly there is a give and take there. The difference is the big challenge and the big opportunity is that while Canada is a mature economy, India is a developing country. So we have our challenges, we have our facets that we need to cover. For example, we are very strong in the services. India is a very young country. We have surplus manpower, highly skilled manpower, and we seek satisfaction in services. Canada has its own strengths, and Canada seeks satisfaction in those areas, but it's work in progress, and we have already chipped away. I think I cannot put a time frame, nor would I like to put a time frame to it, but I'm quite bullish and optimistic that given the political will on both sides, which does exist, we can clinch it sooner than later.
Murad is one of the largest producers and exporters of lentils and pulses. in the world, and in particular to India. First of all, are these agreements very important to you? And would India be kind of your first choice about for the country that Canada should next negotiate an agreement with?
Well, I think that, we can't ignore the population growth, and I think, that key figure of the middle income, not only the number of middle income participants, but that growth rate, kind of fueling that growth from 21 trillion to an estimate of 56 trillion in Asia by 2030, the middle income, spending patterns. Pulses are not something that most Canadians, think about because we don't consume a lot, but Saskatchewan is now producing 65% of the world trade of lentils, 60% of the world trade of peas, and, we crossed over 10 million acres of production, and our exports of just lentils this year to India alone is going to be over $1 billion. So from the perspective of it being a key economic driver in terms of the wealth and prosperity of Western Canadian farmers and a balance for the cyclicality that we're seeing in both the oil and gas sector and the mining sector, agriculture is becoming a very important part of, feeding the world. And when we look at demand in Asia, in particular India and China, these are, very important aspects of being able to move the productive capacity. This is a renewable resource, Brooke. We can't forget that, when we look at that as an economic driver from a sustainability perspective, it's an exciting multi-billion-dollar opportunity that we have to capitalize on. So India has to be there.
And how much do you need sort of economic diplomacy to play a role in this? Or, are you so competitive that you don't have to worry about whether Canada signs agreements with India or
any exporter or any large player who thinks that market access and clarity that is reached by free trade agreements. I mean, it's not only about tariffs. Really, to me, the most important part of the bilateral agreements are clarity around foreign investment, clarity around phytosanitary regulations, rules, market access, and non-tariff trade barriers being regulated with dispute resolution mechanisms that allow us to achieve the certainty for the capital we deploy into those markets. That's why we have to be at the table in these markets. It's not just to reduce tariffs. It's a very short-sighted view.
And just to stay with India one more second, I mean, do you find, I know from my own time in India that there's, sensitivities about food imports in India. Do you find as an exporter to India that you encounter those sensitivities, and how are you able to overcome them?
Listen, we're dealing in the most sensitive of all commodities, basic foods, which is an extremely political issue. And, but I do give a lot of credit to the current government where the recognition is there that the supply-demand gap is rising, and that governmental policy should be aimed at increasing local production, but they cannot keep pace with population and income growth. So, import, facilitation and, open markets in pulse crops, this is something that India consumes 23 million tons of pulses annually, projected to go to 36 million tons by 2030. So, and Canada is the solution to that, particular dilemma.
Michael, I think of you as being a bit of a dissenting voice on this panel because your business, I believe, is primarily domestic. You
Yes.
Run an airline which services northern Canada, I think.
Yeah, I'm thinking about new service to Regina, though. To be honest with you.
I happen to be the chair of the Economic Development Agency, so let's talk.
After, we'll go.
Exactly.
See, it's already done.
But I think your point of view is that with all this talk of international trade and free trade agreements, people are kind of neglecting opportunities at home. Is that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think your next guest, the person that you're going to interview next, is probably one of the best cheerleaders the nation has, our Prime Minister, Prime Minister Trudeau 23, not 15. And I think that it's really interesting to understand that there is an emphasis that's being placed on First Nations investments. And the Prime Minister in the most recent budget, and your earlier guest this morning, the Finance Minister, have put together a budget that earmarks $8.4 billion over the next 5 years that will be spent to improve the lives of First Nations people. And that's the core market that I serve, and our company, WASAYA Group, serves. And I think that there's a great opportunity right here at home as well. Don't misunderstand me. We are a nation of traders. That is what Canada is based upon, and that is what Canada needs, effective trade relationships and effective bilateral air transportation agreements. But within Canada, we have this impoverished nation that is sort of above the 49th parallel, which is where the vast majority of Canadians live, that has an opportunity for growth and economic development. The government is putting an $8.4 billion stimulus in place. I think there's great opportunities there.
And what kind of policy, in addition to contributing to the development of those regions, what kinds of infrastructure policies, other sorts of policies do you need actually to take advantage and to make that opportunity real?
Well, we're owned 100% by the First Nations, 12 First Nations. And one of the things that routinely comes up with us is that First Nations people should have everything that all Canadians enjoy. Things that are as basic as clean drinking water. There are First Nations that have had boil water advisories for over 40 years in place, and yet their water is being siphoned off into places like Winnipeg and others for fresh water. So just basic necessities, there should be policies that allow for First Nations people to be recognized as full Canadians and have the exact same rights and abilities to what we all enjoy every day in their First Nation communities.
Vishnu, I'd like to move on to talk about some trade agreements that don't directly affect India, but I'm sure you're following very closely. And what do you think are the prospects for actually completing the TPP and the agreement with Europe? And what sort of effect do you think that's going to have on Canada's trade profile?
Well, as you know, we are not a member of TPP yet. And
yet. We can come back to that.
The prospects, I'm not the right person to comment on. I mean, I should be turning to you to tell me what's the prospects of completion of the TPP agreement. But
I'll pass that back to somebody else.
Having said that, I think in the globalized village that we are, the way forward are these such agreements, whether they are bilateral or regional or multilateral. And I also wanted to just make a comment, add to what, or take up from what Michael had mentioned about the opportunities in Canada and abroad. It's, as he himself noted, it is not either or, it's and also. Mm-hmm. The center of economic gravity is shifting to Asia. India is a country of 1.3 billion people. And there are huge opportunities out there. And so the name of the game is to engage more rapidly, more widely, more deeply, and that's beneficial to each and every nation.
Do you think that through these trade agreements you might see, or through the TPP in particular, you might see Canada executing kind of a pivot to Asia similar to the one that the United States has already embarked on?
Well, if you see the mandate letters issued by Prime Minister Trudeau to his ministers, and here I'm particularly talking of the mandate letter issued to the Minister of International Trade, Prime Minister Trudeau has tasked his minister to pay special attention to building trade and economic relations with China and India. And in my interactions with the government, I do hear greater emphasis and focus on Asia Pacific, and we welcome that. And we, on our part, we do see Canada as a priority nation, and we are looking forward to, we are working very actively to expanding this relationship.
Murad, what do you see, I mean, in addition to India, what do you think are the going to be Canada's most important trading partners, should be Canada's most important trading partners in the 5 or 10 years ahead?
Well, I was very fortunate to be involved with the advisory that came up with the advice that became the Global Market Action Plan of the Canadian government. And one of the things that we really focused on in that particular consultation was staying ahead of the game. I mean, if we look at our global commerce strategy, the first time around, it was a very broad, with a focus on, Latin America and the Caribbean was a focus. Well, in the second, round of this strategy, we really tried to drill down on what are the current priorities. You can't ignore the India and the Chinas, and of course, we're talking about beyond the U.S., but as our High Commissioner has said, I'm not advocating that we don't think about the incredible opportunity in the U.S. and Europe. So those are, continuing to be focuses, but we need to stay ahead, meaning 5 years and 10 years from now, we're focusing as a company and as a province in Saskatchewan, we're focusing very much on the next 6, countries like Colombia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Egypt, Turkey, South Africa, countries that have what I would call springboard potential. The UAE as a transshipment point for the GCC countries. Turkey is in that list as a result of the instability in the region, and Turkey being the country that is relatively the only stable country in that particular region that would be able to supply the countries in the North Africa, Middle East region. So Canadian companies participating in global value chains, we've talked a lot about it, but we need to do more than just export. So we need to export. We need to be looking at strategic partnerships, local processing facilities, distribution facilities. We need to be participating as a part of larger companies on subcontracting bases. We need to be in the markets and we need to be staying there. And our government needs to lead forward that next 10 years. By the time we get to Turkey and Indonesia, we don't want everybody else in the world to have already been there, and we're trying to clean up the scraps. So I think that that's really important to be forward and ahead of the game.
Right. So, and that means actually beginning formal trade negotiations with some of these markets that you mentioned.
I think that certainly as my colleague and I were talking backstage. I mean, open skies, air agreements, foreign investment protection agreements. There's a whole realm of preparatory work that has to go into setting economic frameworks prior to getting to comprehensive economic partnership agreements and free trade negotiations. So I'm certainly seeing a strong interest on the new government side to keep doing that. We have a very active new trade minister. I've been pretty impressed, I think, with her energy. And we need to get a plan, and we need to keep rolling along to get ready. And then we need to choose our opportunities. While I say get prepared, we can't negotiate 20 agreements. And frankly, agreements for the sake of agreements aren't what I'm looking for. I want an agreement that actually has matched Canadian interests, where we can actually commercialize post-agreement. It's not only about having it and putting it on the shelf.
I mean, are you excited about TPP and CETA, or are they?
I mean, listen, these are large agreements. We have to be at the table. We're a trading nation. It's not only about opening up access to new opportunities, it's about preserving our market position and ensuring that we're on level playing field with the others who are at the table. And as a trading nation, we can't be absent from these types of agreements.
And I think, Brooke, it's important to have that parallel approach. The agreements that Murad is talking about are years in the making. These are things that are not just, you can't just pull these things together in a heartbeat. Those are happening over years and through different administrations as well within the Canadian government. And then, not to harp back on the dissenting voice piece again, but the reality is there's also home markets that we can be looking at. And I think that one of the things that has to be looked upon as a great opportunity is the emergence of the First Nations people, the Métis and the Inuit. There's great opportunities in the north, and quite frankly, folks, with the permafrost layer moving northward, it's allowing for exploration of fossil fuels, but also precious metals, gemstones, things that Canada hasn't had for decades. And those are great economic opportunities for us as we move forward.
And what about the role of open skies agreement or the lack of open skies agreements in promoting trade? How much of a hindrance is that in your view, and what needs to be done to get more of them?
Yeah, I mean, if you can't get to the markets that you're trying to get to, if Murad can't get to India, then there's a problem. And if there's a squabble between two nations about getting air service between those 2 points, you may recall just a few years ago, Canada had a debate going on, if I could characterize it as a debate between the United Arab Emirates and Canada. And United Arab Emirates, we were talking off stage, and I know I'm simplifying here, Murad, but United Arab Emirates has one city, basically, Dubai, that Air Canada can fly to as a flag carrier of Canada. Yet Emirates, as the flag carrier of the United Arab Emirates, when they go to choose their one city, they're saying, well, wait, we want Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, Vancouver, Calgary, maybe even Halifax. And when the chief air negotiators get together and start talking about, well, what do you want? What do we want? What am I prepared to give? What are you prepared to give? If there's one city that Dubai can give, and the United Arab Emirates wants 6 cities in Canada, there's an imbalance. So that's why these agreements take such a long period of time to negotiate and work through. And certainly Air Canada would have their issues with Emirates flying to all those nations. I'm sure Air Canada would love to have their flights on those as well. So you have to have effective bilateral agreements with the countries so that trade can happen. And that bilateral transportation agreement or air service agreement has to include both passenger service, but also goods and materials that have to go between, and services.
Murad, I think you were involved with the Emerson report on infrastructure. What kind of infrastructure does Canada need in order to follow up on the new trading relationships that it's going to be forming?
Yeah, I mean, the Emerson report was a fascinating, thing to be involved with, and over 18 months we did, hundreds of consultations across the country, and I focused mostly on Western Canada, the grain sector, potash, oil and gas, and the rail infrastructure, and looking at this emerging opportunity in Asia, and also even with the Europe trade agreement, we really need to focus on gateways. We need to get back to long-term planning and infrastructure, not a knee-jerk reaction. I mean, I look at Australia. They have a 50-year major projects infrastructure listing that is moving on an annual basis. Where levels of federal governments, municipal governments, provincial governments, can collaborate to make sure that those impediments get done. That not only takes a look at the Pacific Gateway 2, which is something that we've advocated in that report. We think that has to be a priority of the infrastructure plan going forward. The North, that was just mentioned. I mean, there's tremendous potential to look at, the climate change effect and also the opportunity to utilize the North as another gateway. So, what we're really hoping to see is the government take that report, plug it into the 10-year plan. And, the Pacific Gateway initiative that happened in 2005, 6, 7 was tremendously successful to leverage funds. I think just one more thing, if I can say one more thing, Brooke, on that. The talk about mobilizing, private sector resources, is a very essential element of the whole infrastructure equation. We need bankable projects. So, we've recommended in that report that government look at, what types of projects can be banked up and be offered out to the private sector to generate funds that can free up to deploy into projects that maybe aren't, ideal for that type of a public-private partnership. So, things like, taking a look at our airports and, whether or not our airports, can be looked at, as vehicles that could, in essence, be, opened up to private investment, toll roads, rail infrastructure in partnership. These are all things that I think have tremendous potential. If we can't get our product to market, we will not capitalize on what is happening in India and China. And I think that is, what I would view as the generational opportunity or constraint. The jury will judge us 30 years from now.
I think two of you have now mentioned the sort of, if I understood you correctly, the opportunities opened up by climate change. I realize this isn't exactly what this panel is about, but should we really be thinking of climate change in terms of opportunity? I mean, shouldn't we much more be thinking about it in terms of threat? And if we begin to think about it in terms of opportunity, does that blunt the, some of the political momentum that you're now seeing?
Brooke, don't mistake my comment. My comment is reactionary. I mean, it's certainly no advocation that climate change is a positive thing. We're facing it, and what we're saying is that permafrost is receding. So as a result of the reality, I think that what we have to do is look at what is the opportunity to solve the societal problem of the North by encouraging economic development. I think that's all we were saying.
Okay.
Well, and I think, though, as well, it is happening. So this is happening. We can take steps to try to mitigate it and even take steps to try to reverse it if possible. But the reality is it's happening. And there are those that are out there taking advantage of it. The Ring of Fire. Has anybody heard of the Ring of Fire? Yeah. Of course you have. Chromium, cadmium, copper, zinc, all of those metals that are out there that are now accessible because of receding permafrost is opportunity for mining companies. And junior mining, despite commodity prices recently, junior mining has been quite active lately. Within the territory that I have, within the Ring of Fire, there are a bunch of First Nations that also have to be addressed as far as whether or not they're going to permit mining to take place. And some former prime ministers, Prime Minister Turner, for example, and others have been trying to work with the First Nations to advocate for them to be able to appropriately be compensated when mining companies do move in.
I think maybe it isn't the ghost of Trump, but Trump is haunting this room today to some extent.
Where is he?
He's everywhere. I'd be curious to hear from each of you very briefly how you think a Trump presidency might affect the customer for 70% of Canada's goods. Maybe I'll start with Vishnu.
Well, I really would like to reserve my comments because I really do not think that I'm in a position to predict or make any suggestion about how the Trump presidency will, if there is going to be a Trump presidency, how it's going to play out. So I will defer to my esteemed colleagues here.
I mean, listen, at the end of the day, I am maybe a bit too much of an eternal optimist. There will have to be a moderation of the position. It's the largest, most powerful nation in the world. And there are checks and balances in the political system there. That, the presidency, I think the one thing that I feel relatively confident in is that, he is smart enough to surround himself with good people, and we'll have to, take a look at the effects. I'm not as doom and gloom as some people in this room. I'm not, thinking that the world will end, the day after the presidency is decided in the U.S. I think that, as somebody mentioned earlier, Brooke, it's going to take time to see any real, change in the way that the U.S. is positioned, and I think that we'll be just fine.
Well, let me be the dissenting voice again.
That's your designated role.
That's my role, I guess, on the panel. I think it's really scary when in the 1980s we finally took down a wall between East and West Berlin, and somebody's talking about putting up walls again. That really scares me from a political perspective and from a free trader perspective. I'm definitely a free trader, and I think that Canada, of course, is definitely a nation of free traders. Having said that, to Murad's point, the administration is forever. Politicians come and go, but the administration typically is forever. I take comfort in that thought, that there is a political element to this, but there's also an administration or a bureaucracy behind the politicians that keep the checks and balances in place. Who comes out of the Trump, if Trump is a president, I think New Brunswick came across with the best idea I had ever seen, which was offering political asylum to Americans. I thought that was the best way to get immigration into New Brunswick. What a great idea. So maybe some other provinces could do the same.
Murad, going back to your point about Australia's 50-year infrastructure plan, presumably you're encouraged that this government is planning to spend more money on infrastructure. Do you think they're going about it the right way?
I think they're still planning, and I think we heard from the finance minister this morning. One of the things that I'm hopeful for is the adoption of a national transportation strategy framework, and part of that would be the building of this, constraints and opportunities list, that will allow us to properly frame the Pacific Gateway and the Northern Gateway and an Eastern, Atlantic Gateway, and it'll match that up to our trade priorities. Take it out long term, deploy funds into strategic projects, package up so the private sector can get involved. Then I think we'll be doing it right. So the talk about $10 billion a year, $120 billion in infrastructure, I'm encouraged by that as long as we have a plan where we don't just go for shovel-ready projects that are nice ribbon cuttings. I want to deploy those for the economic prosperity of Canadians long term. And when I look out a 30 and 40-year time horizon, we need to recognize that we are a large land-based, harsh climated country. And as a result of that, infrastructure needs to be prioritized to ensure we can get our products to market.
I think there was, and Murad, you may be familiar with this, there was the Canadian Chamber of Commerce came out with a national transportation plan proposal.
Yes.
about 10 years ago,
Yes.
10 or so years ago. Fantastic document which talked about how Canadians can get their goods and services to the international markets. Unfortunately, nothing has happened subsequent to that, really to be able to get some traction in that regard. If Canada wants to do international trade, we also have to have the ability to do interprovincial trade first. Trucking companies, believe it or not, going between, oh, did I get an applaud out there? All right. Trucking companies going between Saskatchewan and Manitoba and Ontario. Taillights have to be a different location on trucks. I mean, these are silly things that are impeding trade interprovincially, not just nationally and internationally. These are things that I think that the government can set the framework on to help to be able to facilitate interprovincial trade as much as national and international trade.
We've talked a lot about merchandise trade, but one of the things that Canada is very good at is services. So I'd be interested. Maybe I'll start with you, Vishnu. What do you think are the opportunities for Canada in services with respect to India and other countries? And how important do you think the trade and services agreement could be in freeing up trade and services?
I think this is a very important area. Let me give an India-specific example. We have seeing massive investments in infrastructure happening in India. Smart cities we are planning to roll out 100 smart cities over the next 20 years. 20 smart cities have been announced. Now, in the area of urban planning, Canada has a lot of strengths. And this is one area in which Canada can look at opportunities and is looking at opportunities in India. Clean technologies is another area. IT is another area. So there are a number of areas in which, when it comes to services, Canada can offer valuable services which will be of interest, and partner with other countries like India in those areas.
And do you think a trade and services agreement is part of that equation?
Very much so. When we talk of CEPA in between India and Canada, it's the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which is both goods and services. As I mentioned up front, for us, services is very, very important, given the fact that we are now hoping that demographic dividend will accrue to India. With 10 to 11 million youngsters entering the job market every year, highly skilled manpower, for us, services is very important.
All right.
Listen, we talked a lot about goods. Just to finish that off, more value added is important in our goods sector, but certainly the opportunity in the tech industries, education and training, and the clean technologies, we see as great opportunities in the emerging markets. And I think that we as a country have to determine where we want to be in terms of our economy. And there's a lot of talk about the rebuilding of domestic manufacturing and all of these things. I'm a strong advocate of manufacturing. We run processing plants all over the world, and in Western Canada we have 17 plants. But we got to choose what type of manufacturing we're going to do. We have to be realistic. We're not going to be the lowest cost manufacturer, of just any old widget. But using technology, using our expertise, R&D, and our ability to commercialize that R&D, I think that's where we're going to have the competitive advantage, and that will then open opportunities for us, for the service companies, to go abroad and to look at participating in those global value chains I talked about. So, I think that's a very dynamic part of our growth platform going forward, is that Canadian expertise is not only respected, but we have a different approach to the way we approach the markets in the world. I think that's a key advantage.
When the Prime Minister made the comment that he wanted Canada to be known for, resourcefulness rather than resources, was that something you welcomed, or do you think?
I think that to downplay the resource sector in our economy, we don't need to have one or the other, certainly. The resource sector in this country, and a balance between oil and gas, mining, agricultural, commodities, but the real key thing is value added. I mean, why are we shipping all the commodities around the world and allowing all of the value added to be done there? We're shipping semi-refined products. We're cleaning, we're splitting, we're extracting protein from lentils, shipping it to 120 countries around the world as a company. And that's insulating us away from that commodity cyclicality. I think that we can have a strong resource sector and we can be very resourceful.
Well, I could follow up on that, but I think what I would like to do now is to start asking for some questions from the floor. And I see we do have one from an app, and so I'm going to pose that. Question. And the question is, when we talk about the next emerging economies, how can you determine which will see the explosive growth of China, India, which are bound by political instability, like Russia? I think he probably means those that will see explosive growth of China and India. How are they distinguished from those which are affected by instability like Russia and Brazil? I think that's the burden of the question. So maybe if I can start with you, Vishnu, on that.
Brazil and Russia, along with South Africa and India and China, are BRICS countries. And these are, Russia as well as Brazil are very large countries. They are important countries. And they are large economies, and we do have a good partnership with them, important partnership with them, and we do look forward to seeing greater opportunities, greater cooperation among BRIC countries, not just among BRIC countries, but between India and all our partner countries.
Listen, I think that our foreign policy initiatives and our trade priorities have to be more interconnected. And, we as a nation have been, always very careful to sever those, where I look at the US and, other countries where they link them almost to a fault. So when we do that linkage of foreign policy and trade policy, it actually allows us to prioritize countries where we actually have a view that there's a relative political stability or economic stability that matches the Canadian capability. So when I advocate looking at the next 6 or the next 8 countries to make sure we're not too late, I'd like a broad, coordinated, political, foreign affairs and trade strategy. So if India becomes an important, element of our economic policy, I think on a foreign relations prospect, it'll be similar. Turkey's another one. I mean, it's a NATO country, very unstable region, but the Prime Minister and Prime Minister Erdogan hit it off at G20. We expect that relationship to flourish.
You're portraying Turkey as a very stable place, but I think a lot of people...
Hey, I mean, you know what? When you've got Iran, Iraq, Syria all around you, Turkey's very stable.
Well, I would say yes, relative to the neighborhood.
It's all about your neighbors, right?
It's pretty, but in absolute, relative to Canada...
relative to Canada. But listen, we're not talking apples to apples.
Right.
What I look at when I look at stability is relative economic stability, democratically elected governments. I look at Turkey as a country where 86% of the eligible voters voted in the last election. I mean, we should envy that in Canada. We can't get that type of political engagement. So, sure, there's faults. There's no doubt. We're always very carefully watching. But when you're sitting in a situation where you've got neighbors attacking from all sides, we as a nation need to stand behind countries like that to make sure that we can keep that little pocket of relative stability, because the consequences are bad otherwise.
Michael, I think that, Murad was just talking about the importance of linking foreign policy and trade policy, but one of the things we're seeing with China at the moment is that, that can be a little bit awkward. I mean, China seems to be saying, well, we're happy to dance with you, but keep quiet about certain aspects of the way we run our system. How should Canada handle a situation like that?
Yeah, I think that there has to be an element of basic human rights that has to be a part of any of these negotiations, and I think the Trudeau government is taking a very strong stand on that, and we're seeing that come forward. But I think that also there has to be a quid pro quo. We have our largest trading partner, the United States, that we have to have that essentially as a part of the negotiations always. But to the question that came in from the app, one of the things that I think is most important for anybody who's doing business outside of Canada is to have a balanced approach to where you are putting your resources and deploying your capital. It's super important. It's just like managing your investment portfolio to be diversified and have the ability to pivot from Turkey if something goes really sideways, to be able to go to Brazil or to go to China, or to go to Taiwan if China starts to go sideways. Those are things that I think are really important for us, and that's where the government can help to facilitate that through effective trade agreements and effective relationships that way.
My question is for Michael. So why do you think sometimes provinces think of trade as purely international and are more happy to have imports of, say, wine from a foreign country than they are from another province?
Yeah, it gets to the delineation, I think, between the federal jurisdiction and the provincial jurisdictions, and provinces like to have some sort of relevance, so they choose to put up obstacles for importation of British Columbia beer or wine into Alberta, for example. I think, wasn't it Terry Mulligan, a very public case recently? Terry Mulligan decided he was going to take a case of beer across the Alberta-British Columbia line and was busted. So I think there has to be a much more nationalistic approach to interprovincial trade. And I think that it's really just Alberta or British Columbia or any of the provinces or territories saying, well, ours is a better policy than the rest of the country, therefore ours should take precedence over the rest.
Can I,
Hi. Sorry, Ailish Campbell from Finance Canada. And my question, well, first of all, let me just say, Michael, kudos to you for recognizing the demographic and commercial opportunity that we have with First Nations. I think a lot of Canadians don't always appreciate that, in fact, our First Nations were our first free traders. And they were here a long time before 150 years, so kudos to you for that. My question to the panel, Murad, I know that you've spent a lot of your own personal time consulting as part of the Emerson panel on the CTA review, the Canadian Transportation Act. You talked a little bit about gateways. Can I challenge you just to go a little bit further there and tell us where you see bottlenecks in the Canadian infrastructure system? Because it's not just a matter of investing in infrastructure, but in investing in growth, producing infrastructure. And I could really appreciate the views of the panel on that. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, certainly when I look at, the concept of gateways, it really is the interconnectivity of road, rail, and, port infrastructure. And, I think when I look at the bottlenecks, we've got to recognize that the Port of Vancouver has bottlenecks. So, getting across the bridges to the North Shore, this is, a problem that's been discussed for years and years, but we need a comprehensive plan to identify those bottlenecks, figure out what we can, fix in the next, number of years for the next 10 and 20 years. But I think we have to look beyond. Port of Prince Rupert is certainly a great opportunity that, needs to be, developed further. And so a second, deep sea port, to be able to balance. And then when I look at the Atlantic Gateway, we need some sort of coordination period. We don't need 4, ports in Atlantic Canada. We need to have some sort of a priority on what's going to be done where. And we need to ensure that the dollars are getting spent to be able to give us that bang for the buck in 20 and 30 and 40 years, recognizing that we could be a gateway for North America, not just for the Canadian market, out, but it's all about, the transportation infrastructure has got to be balanced out and in. So that's the thing I don't think we always recognize, is that we think about export, but you've also got to think about facilitation of imports in. Prince Rupert's a great example. Asian imports, or Asian exports come into Rupert, and in 96 hours, CN Rail moves them to Chicago, right? So that type of thing is very important, and it drives economic activity. Long Beach is going to continue to be congested. We're competing with U.S. ports, and I think there's a great opportunity for Canada to be the hub entry point that could bring huge economic activity for the country.
well,
Can I do quickly?
super quick. The all-powerful clock is run to zero.
The airports. We've got to get a cost-competitive airport out there, folks. We've put our airports out through the Canada Airports Act to independent airport authorities that are making our airports uncompetitively expensive, and that's costing us trade. So, for what it's worth.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to summarize because we've run out of time, but it's been a fascinating panel. Please thank our panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.